A skelly Greenfinger pulled the trigger on a corroded copper pistol. The pistol went off without a sound, except for the scream from the flying babblefish. The fish didn't fall immediately to the ground, but twisted in circles as air fluttered out from under its skin. It dropped into the fire. "Great," one of the green things said. "Who the hell can eat hot meat?" "Serves you right, Frank," said the yellow-bellied one. Frank sucked some gravel out from under his foot and flipped it into the flame. He reached out with his tongue and scratched above his eye. The third member of the party started laughing. His fat, green belly shook as his lungs stirred up dust. Another fish sputtered in the fire. "Great," Frank said again. "It only means that you have to shoot the stupid things before they get there." "I wish I would," Frank said. "I hate the smell." He stood up and moved to a rock that wasn't downwind of the fire. The wind seemed to know its distaste. It changed direction. The fat one stopped laughing and just sat smiling while the other two looked at him. "Spit it out, Dave," Frank finally growled. "It's just that I didn't expect you to believe the old egg layers' tales." Frank swelled his chin a few times before he finally said, "Why didn't you say something while I was making the fire?" "I thought you were stalling," Dave said. "I wasn't stalling. It attracts game." Frank swelled his chin larger than he had before, exposing small pinkish cracks under the green. Yellowbelly scratched himself on the tail and ignored the disgusted looks of his friends. "And besides," Frank continued, "aren't most of the old egg layers' tales true? What about survival of the middleest?" Dave shook his head. "It only leads to a lot of pushing and shoving." "But no one survives on the edge," Frank protested. "I did," Dave boasted. In disbelief, Frank shook his head. He leaned back and raised his chin a little more to add to the effect. "Are you calling me a liar?" Frank lifted his webbed hand and raised it to his throat and mimicked, "Who, me?" with his mouth. In a boastful display, Dave filled his chin with air. Frank did the same thing, but immediately reached for his pistol. Seeing Frank's reaction, Dave grabbed for his pistol as well. "Stop it, both of you!" Yellowbelly yelled. "Can't you see what he's doing?" He had one eye fixed on Frank and the other on Dave. "Frank, stop stalling! If you don't have the courage, then give it up!" Frank let the air out of his chin with a frop sound. Dave immediately did the same thing, only his sound was a little lower and longer than Frank's. "I bet you do pretty good with that," Frank said. "I do all right," Dave said, dropping his pistol next to him. "You know what they say about the oldies and the ladies." "How would it be to be chased?" Frank wondered. "Not that bad," Dave said, not knowing it was a rhetorical question. "Too bad the season's over for me." Frank quickly raised his pistol. "Not for me," he said, as he shot a blackfire that was headed for the flame. It was a small one, and he really wasn't hungry, but he couldn't stand the smell of another fire in the fire. Now it was Yellowbelly's turn to shake his head. "You were right, Dave. He only started the fire so he could be distracted. Give it up, Frank. Why don't you just decide which one of us won?" "Not so fast," Frank said, shifting his eyes around the camp. "I'm ready. I'm just not sure that you are." Frank cleared his throat, opened his mouth wide enough so that his chin touched the top of his belly. He rubbed the roof of his mouth, yawned, stretched out his arms, and waited for his friends to return their attention. "This will be the best you've ever seen," Frank boasted. "Even if I am a little green." Yellowbelly was scratching his tail again, and Dave had picked up the blackfire and was now gumming its carcass, spreading its black tar across his yellow-green lips and down his chin. "Stop playing with your food," Yellowbelly said. Dave just stopped what he was doing and looked at where Yellowbelly's hand was. Yellowbelly quietly removed his hand and pretended that nothing had happened. "And while we're on the subject," Dave announced, "why don't we call this whole thing quits? Because it stinks." Frank raised his weapon. "You haven't given me a chance." "Hey," Dave said, raising his hands and extending his fingers so that the webbing was clearly visible. "Your game. I just want to have as much fun as you had." Fun this, Frank said, shooting into the fire. 1,000 tiny sparks erupted from the pit, crackling and sputtering as they flew off into the air. Stop it, Frank, Yellow Belly demanded. Get on with it, Dave said, holding his hands over his face. Right, Frank said. Frank clawed up some dirt from the ground. He took a few steps away from the fire, spread out his webbed feet, and leaned back on his tail. After pointing his head up at the sky and licking his lips, he pumped a small bit of air under his chin. He then let it out, dropped the dust into his mouth, and pumped up his chin again. He forced in as much air as his chin would take, and then filled his belly and the 2 pouches in his back. When he was finished, Frank looked something like a red mushroom with green spots on a tripod with eyes. He filled himself a little more and then tightened his stomach muscles, his leg muscles, his chest, his cheeks until he couldn't hold it anymore. He let go with all the force he had, screaming but not screaming. Instead, the ground shuddered under the vibration of the frop. He blew the air out with all his force, throwing the dust high into the air, along with the glowing pink dye. When he was finished, he couldn't move. Paralysis. He stood and waited for the others' approval. He had done his best, but it didn't seem to be good enough. He finally broke the silence. Well, how did I do? Dave looked up with one eye, while his other eye scanned the forest. Yellow Belly's mouth hung slightly open. His chest moved up and down slowly. Great, Frank said again, trying to move before the paralysis wore off. It didn't do him any good. Dave mouthed a few words before his eyes finally focused on Frank. Well, it wasn't that bad. Yellow Belly looked at Dave sideways. Great, Frank said again. Don't do this to me. It stunk, didn't it? Oh, come on, Frank. Don't be so hard on yourself. Great. It's up to you, Frank. Who won? Don't hit me up with those questions right now. I can't answer. Come on, Frank. All right, it was Dave. I'll get you. A grin spread across Dave's face while Yellow Belly sat and sulked. There was a rustling in the distant trees. Wait a minute, Frank said. Dave and Yellow Belly both looked at one another while the sound became louder. Frank tried to break his paralysis. Again. The rustling came closer, only now it sounded like limbs were being shaken from the trees. Probably just a couple of quails hiding behind the bushes. Very funny, Frank replied. A sound came closer, only now trees were falling. I don't believe it, Yellow Belly yelled. Yeah, Dave yelled over the oncoming sound. But how big is she? Frank started to worry. Yellow Belly and Dave left the campsite so they could hide in the forest. Frank stood frozen in awe before the oncoming green female. She was beautiful, with her eyes dancing in 2 different directions at once, and her front legs bowed in the most elegant reptilian form. She was twice as high as the trees on all 4s. Frank hadn't realized it, but his bags were full again. He was at the height of ecstasy. The love of his life had come for him, and as she entered the clearing, every muscle in his body tightened. His heart pounded, and he felt weak. He fropped, forcing the air out from all parts of his body, blowing the pink dye high into the air. She was beautiful, with her mouth open and her tongue reaching for him. He began to feel again, but it was too late. Her sticky tongue touched him, grabbed a hold of his body, and ripped him from the ground and into her mouth. That was the last they ever saw of Frank. It was love at first bite. Yellow Belly and Dave came out into the open field only after she had gone. They looked over the long line of broken trees and the squelched fire. That was great, Dave finally shouted. He flipped his tail back and forth. He certainly got chased. Yeah, Yellowbelly replied, acting as strong as Dave. It's too bad we weren't answered like that. Dave looked questioningly at Yellowbelly. I mean... Yellowbelly hesitated. You mean it's a great way to go? Yellowbelly sat down. It's frightening. Frightening? Don't you get frightened, Dave? Petrified, Dave admitted, taking a few steps back. But I love the thrill of the hunted. He opened his mouth, stretched it wide with his hands, and yawned. Same time next season? Do I have a choice? Dave turned around and headed out of the clearing. Hey, Dave, Yellowbelly yelled. Do you think we should declare Frank the winner? After all, he was good sport. Dave didn't stop walking, and Yellowbelly sat and wondered if he would find true love next year, or if he could trick Dave into finding it.